Thank you all for coming back from what I'm sure was a fascinating tour. I really, really wish I could have been with you in person this week. And it's just the usual bureaucracy of visas and passports, plus my own incompetence, that meant that I couldn't travel to be there in person. So enormous thanks to the staff of the Faraday Institute for enabling this rather experimental technological talk. And as has been explained, I've decided to swap the order of the two talks that I was going to give. Nominally, tomorrow I will be speaking about the anthropic principle, whereas today I will be speaking about the foundation of modern evolutionary theory. In reality, as I was preparing these two talks, I realized that the two are inseparable. I have not had the luxury of being with you to hear what you heard this morning about the anthropic principle, but my take on it from what I've read myself is that there tends to be a bit of a jump involved by people whose primary research focus is not biology. And in painting a picture, an exciting picture of a universe which is in some senses predisposed towards life, we make a jump towards the idea that it may be predisposed towards us. And that's really the jump that I want to examine over the course of two talks with you today and tomorrow. Now, I'm taking a bit of a guess at where you're all coming from, and I'm aiming for a centre of gravity. So both of these talks are going to go fairly broad and shallow. And I would ask you to be brave and to interrupt me if necessary, or certainly use the question time to challenge me if what I'm saying to you is already part of your assimilated knowledge, and you really want to probe more deeply on some of the details. So with that, let me turn over now to the slides. And as we see here, I've named today's talk A Contemporary View of Evolution. The image that you see on that first slide is an image that we're going to be dealing with recurrently throughout today and tomorrow. I grabbed it off the web a couple of years ago as a typical textbook demonstration of how we perceive evolution. And the point that I really want to be labouring today and then revisiting tomorrow is, if we move to the next slide, that diagram illustrates a widespread public conception of what we mean by the word evolution, but it reflects an unscientific, pre-Darwinian set of ideas that can actually be traced back to Greek philosophy, namely Aristotle. And these ideas have persisted into our contemporary culture, and that a failure to distinguish between these pre-Darwinian ideas and the true contemporary theory of evolution is a major obstruction to any sort of meaningful debate about the natural theology that surrounds evolution. So that is my point right there. And for the next 50 minutes, I'm really just going to unpack those three statements. Okay? So, moving on to the next slide. Something which seems to be gaining more widespread attention just in the last 2 or 3 years is the extent to which Darwin disliked the word evolution. It may be just a point of trivia to you at this stage, but in The Origin of Species, Darwin used the word evolution precisely once, and it is quite literally his last word on the topic. It is the final word of the final paragraph of the final page of The Origin of Species, and it is used in the passive tense. You can read the paragraph. In fact, let me just whip through it for you. Thus, from war of nature, from famine and death, the most exalted object of which we are capable of conceiving directly follows. There is grandeur in this view of life, that whilst this planet has gone cycling according to the fixed law of gravity, from so simple a beginning, endless forms, most beautiful and most wonderful, have been and are being evolved. Passive tense, evolution, the only occurrence in The Origin of Species. The point that I really want to labour here is that that is no coincidence. That is very deliberate avoidance of that word by Darwin. And the reason for that can be found, if we move to the next slide, by recognising that evolution was in widespread usage long before Charles Darwin wrote The Origin of Species. For example, his grandfather, Erasmus, had written quite extensively on the topic. A poem that has variously been described as a poem of inspired mediocrity and a dreadful piece of poetry was included there in Zoonomia, one of his great works. And again, it's probably not necessary to read the quote this time, but just as mentioned to you here, that his grandfather, long before Charles Darwin was really thinking about biology, let alone about evolution, his grandfather was writing about a contemporary view of this concept of evolution, the idea of organic life starting simple and gradually growing more complex and more sophisticated until it gave rise ultimately to us, human beings. In fact, on the next slide, I can point out that it wasn't even unique to Darwin to talk about human evolution. The Comte de Buffon was a major contributor to pre-Darwinian evolutionary thought, and he was one who's particularly noted for describing quite explicitly the idea that human beings themselves evolved. There was debate at this point about whether different human races represented different species or not, and it's very tied in with the moral debate about slavery. It gave us an easy out on slavery if we regarded other races as being different species. And Comte de Buffon was rather progressive in suggesting that maybe we were all one species, but that during a process of evolution we had diverged from one another. And that was way back there in 1759. In fact, in the next slide, we can move back and realize that the word evolution came with an enormous amount of baggage by the time that Darwin was thinking his biological thoughts. In fact, if we look in the online etymology dictionary, you'll find that the word evolution itself can be dated back to the early 1600s, and it was by the mid-1600s that it was being applied to biological thought. The etymology is significant here, because the word evolution comes from the Latin to unroll a scroll. And therein lies the key to what the pre-Darwinian evolutionary thinkers were talking about. If we move on to the next slide now, the point these early biologists were making was that in studying animal development, how a single fertilized cell can grow into something as complex and wondrous as an adult human being, early developmental biologists, next slide, were coming to consider that there was a meaningful analogy to be drawn by the way in which something single-celled and simple could grow into a complex multicellular creature, and a possible analogous process that could be changing simple species into complex species over time. Now, different people report different thinkers as being the first ones to use the word evolution in this biological context. From my own sort of primitive research on the internet, the earliest that I can find is one Charles Bonnet, a Swiss man, who was writing in 1770 and was quite explicit, talking about the unrolling of creation in a process very analogous to the development of a fertilized zygote cell, as being one that could similarly, over much longer periods of time, have given rise to the complex and wondrous life forms that we experience when we look around us in the modern world. On the next slide, we meet the problem with this line of thinking. The problem is that it really starts to hint that there is some sort of lower and some sort of higher involved in thinking about how species change over time. In fact, the most famous icon of Darwin's theory of evolution is one that Darwin would have very vehemently objected to. That icon that I show in the middle of that picture is one that purely reflects pre-Darwinian thinking about evolution. It reflects a ladder of evolutionary progress, implying that each living species exists somewhere higher or lower on the rungs of this ladder. Now, especially given the context in which you come to my talk, where you've been hearing about medieval cosmology, and maybe this is familiar to all of you anyway, you'll probably be starting to make the connection now to a much deeper and much more long-lived view of natural theology. And on the next slide, we can trace this all the way back to Aristotle and the Scala Naturae, or the great chain of being. Part of Aristotle's philosophy, in fact a cornerstone of his philosophy about nature, was that there was an intuitive hierarchy to nature. Some things were obviously more than other things. In fact, to Aristotle, nature existed on a spectrum between the two extremes of non-being and of absolute being. Absolute being was the good, to a thinker such as Aristotle. Non-being was, well, what it says, was non-existence. And that the flawed material existences that we find around us populating the biosphere are all objects that exist somewhere on this great chain of being. To Aristotle, everything was about purpose and about striving to reach a higher state of being, a higher state of existence. and thus to him, he would locate humans shortly below God. We were the most existent of creatures on earth because of our self-contemplation, our consciousness, our awareness of purpose. Slightly below us were animals that similarly exhibited purpose and movement in everything that they were. Plants less so, rocks and minerals less so still. That was his philosophy of nature, and it was one that had been readily adopted by the early church fathers, and that sort of Greek philosophy was assimilated into church thinking from the earliest times. So, next slide, we find terrific medieval illustrations of this great chain of being, in which really the only adjustment to Aristotle's philosophy of the hierarchical nature would be the addition of various hierarchies of angels and demons to fill in that gap between humans and God. That then would be a medieval manuscript illustrating Aristotle's philosophy, showing us quite literally an order ascending upwards in existence, in consciousness, towards the supreme being of God. And that was the church's way of thinking about nature. And the next slide, you can actually see an illustration drawn directly from Charles Bonnet's work on evolution, or where he describes the process of evolution, how he perceived it, where the Scala Naturae is drawn quite literally as a staircase, an ascending staircase in which different organisms are striving to reach higher and higher steps, with a man standing there resplendent towards the top. But we can see off into the distance there are higher rungs to be achieved. That was the process of evolution that Charles Bonnet visualized, and that was the picture of evolution that was surrounding the pre-Darwinian context for thinking about how species changed into one another over time. Now on the next slide, we can flip over to thinking about the transition that was taking place as we move into Enlightenment Europe. Aristotle was, of course, a philosopher, and philosophy is not the same as science. I can think of no more succinct way of explaining or highlighting the difference than to point to this quote from Bertrand Russell, that Aristotle maintained throughout his life that women have fewer teeth than men, and although he was twice married, it never once occurred to him to verify this statement by examining his wives' mouths. That, then, is a philosopher. A philosopher would be focused on the powers of human reason, and it would be seen as rather substandard thinking if you actually had to go out and make some sort of empirical test. In contrast, next slide, if we move on to science, we would find a simple statement that the scientific method requires that a hypothesis or an idea be ruled out or modified if its predictions are clearly incompatible with experimental tests. And we can note that this also implies that a theory must be testable. Theories which cannot be tested do not qualify as scientific theories. That's from a short essay. I guess it's not the most amazing piece of prose ever written, but it's one that I set my undergraduates every year when we start teaching evolution to really get us thinking from the beginning. What are we doing in the science classroom? And what are the boundaries on the areas of debate that legitimately belong within our scientific classroom? If we cannot test it, then it is not science. And that is the problem with pre-Darwinian thinking about evolution. Now, before we return to biology, if we flip to the next slide, we can revisit ideas of medieval cosmology, and I know that you've had a whole lecture on this, so that illustration there should be ringing bells with you, of the series of concentric spheres in which the heavenly bodies were thought to orbit. Once again, attributable to a Greek philosopher, this time Plato, or the pre-Platonics, and it was absorbed and adjusted by Plato. And that was something that was absorbed and retained intact by Catholic theology pretty much from the earliest days of the Church all the way through to the Renaissance. If at any point during that period you had asked people to explain the cosmos, that would have been the sort of explanation you would have got. And if you'd been asked to explain causality, then aside from philosophical musings about first causes and necessary existence, the point would have been that things are the way they are because God made them that way. And that's illustrated quite literally in Michelangelo's Sistine Ceiling, where we see God creating the heavenly spheres and placing them in their orbits. And yet, of course, as we move forwards, next slide, into the latter points of the Renaissance and the early age of reason, moving into the Enlightenment, we start to see the systematic re-evaluation of that cosmology based on the scientific principle, what can we test about this model? And the tests, of course, give rise to a radically different vision of the cosmos. I see some concern. Is there a problem with sound? Are we okay, Zoe?
We're fine.
Okay.
We need Copernicus yet. That's the point.
Okay. So, of course, if we move to the next slide, we can see a fairly linear and fairly famous transition of scientists who, through making observations and experiments, radically re-evaluated our position in the cosmos, moving the Earth from the centre, re-evaluating us as just one of a series of balls of matter orbiting through fixed laws of nature. And on the next slide, I want to draw your attention to the concept of a mechanical universe. This was the concept that the Enlightenment cosmologists were reaching, and this is the concept that was dominating 17th century thought about what it is that we're looking at when we stare upwards into the sky. It wasn't so much that they were doing away with the existence of creation or of God, but rather more that they felt that they were digging a level deeper, and instead of merely describing the handiwork of God, they were uncovering the laws by which God had created the cosmos. This can be, I guess, explained analogically by one of the favourite machines at the time, an orrery, shown there, which is a clockwork machine designed to illustrate how the planets orbit around the sun. You turn the handle and the planets move. The point here is that we have natural laws at work which are explaining the heavenly bodies and their motions. And in fact, on the next... sorry, my slides were not quite where I thought they'd be. So the next slide, we can turn our attention back to nature and ask how that form of thinking was being applied to the natural world. Once again, if you had asked anybody at any point between the Greek philosophers and the Renaissance to explain the existence of natural order, the point would have been that God made it that way. Once again, the Sistine Chapel gives us a beautiful illustration of hands-on creation, God creating us almost in the form of a diorama. And yet in the early Enlightenment, we find figures applying themselves with just as much zeal to uncover the workings of nature as they were to uncover the workings of heavenly nature. Carl Linnaeus is worthy of particular attention here, and of course we all know him for the Linnaean system. But what he was actually doing is worth thinking about rather more carefully. Carl Linnaeus was an exceptionally arrogant man, and his thought was that he could really pick up where Adam had left off. If you had asked people in the Renaissance why the animals were named what they were, the answer was because they were brought before Adam and Adam had given them those names. Carl Linnaeus thought there'd been a bit of a lapse in that process for some 1600 years, well, I guess a couple more thousand plus 1600, and he decided to pick up on that process by going about and systematically naming nature, getting rid of arbitrary namings and finding out what were the true relationships that bound organic nature together. On the next slide, we see that his masterwork, the Systema Naturae, was where he put down his findings. And what's astonishing is how much progress he made within a single lifetime. When he first tried to describe nature, or his first edition of Systema Naturae, he came up with 10 pages published in 1735. And yet within his lifetime it went as far as 13 editions and ended up as 3,000 pages describing all of the organic beings that he had encountered. The point of this success was that what he uncovered was far more than a sort of organic stamp collecting. It wasn't so much naming the animals as once again discovering hidden rules that bound them together in affinities, which made this process very easy once one set about doing it in a scientific manner. To understand what he found, let's move to the next slide and look at some species of beetle. Those are all species of beetle, and each one of them would produce offspring true according to its own kind. If we move to the next slide, we could dissect any one of those types of beetle and find, roughly speaking, the same parts of the same body. We could find, for instance, all those parts of the leg that have been neatly labelled out for us there. And that would be true whether we looked at a gigantic Hercules beetle or a humble seven-spot ladybird. Now, the one point that I want to draw attention to in this beetle is that most insects have two pairs of wings, and if you look at a beetle, the front pair of wings has been hardened into what naturalists would refer to as a lytra, a shield-like carapace that covers over the membranous flying wings that form the hind pair. And those of you who've sat a ladybird on your hand and watched it get startled and fly away, you'll notice the first thing it does is to raise up those elytra. Then the membranous wings underneath will unfurl, and they'll do the flapping, and off it will take into the air. Now that feature is diagnostic of all beetle species. And although a Hercules beetle will always produce Hercules beetles, and a seven-spot ladybird will always produce seven-spot ladybirds, we would find that both of them have elytra. If we now looked out at other species of insects, we would find that the possession of two pairs of wings is something that is shared by a broader grouping here. But in each case, the two pairs of wings have taken on a slightly different form. For example, in the odonata, or the dragonflies, the two pairs of wings are of equal size, and they're used roughly equally in the process of flying. If we look to the group of dipterans, the true flies, we find out that in this case it's the forewings that are doing the flying, and the hind wings have shrunk down to a pair of steering rudders known as halteres. If we turn to the Lepidoptera, we would find two pairs of wings that are fused together to form a single flying surface on each side, and typically that broad surface has been secondarily co-opted to form colourful communication. These form self-defined groups, objective groups, that any observer, anywhere that they're systematically looking at nature, is going to uncover. And they form a very objective hierarchy for naming the species. So on the next slide, we start to see here the principles of biological classification, those that Linnaeus uncovered. We find a natural grouping system that gives us a group called insects that all share characteristics such as 6 legs and antenna and the 3 body segments of head, abdomen, and thorax. But in each case, we find subgroupings where the wings, amongst other characteristics, give us a very natural and objective way to say these things are butterflies, whereas these things are beetles. Now, on the next slide, the point that I really want to underline here is the objectivity of this classification system. To the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans, pretty much anything that swam in the sea was considered a fish, whether it be a dolphin or a shark or a marlin or a tuna. Under the Linnaean system, anybody who looked closely and systematically at the features that group organisms together would come up with a very different system. They would find that dolphins are much more closely related to hippopotamuses than they are to other fish. They're warm-blooded, they're air-breathing, they're viviparous, they're lactating. This is a system which any researcher anywhere in the world can apply themselves to and find themselves putting jigsaw pieces into the same puzzle. It's an objective system and it's a scientific system. It replaces and surpasses Adam naming the animals in that sense. And so, on the next slide, that was the Linnaean system that we're still using today in biology. He was responsible for coming up with the hierarchical classifications of kingdom, class, family, genus, species, and although we've added a couple of others these days, that's the one that still stands. And of great significance to natural theology, Linnaeus was quite unabashed about noticing that man, or humanity, belonged within this system. Humanity is clearly an animal, and it belongs within a group of mammals. And we are connected to nature in a way that is much more direct than previous thinking liked to contemplate. In fact, there's a wonderful book out there that some of you might be interested in called The Metaphysics of Apes. And it describes here in the highlighted passage what it is that Linnaeus found. He says it's quite remarkable that the stupid ape differs so little from the wisest man that the surveyor of nature still has to be found who can draw a line between them. Linnaeus was writing that back in 1766, and his appeal to what made us different had to move into the spiritual and psychological rather than the physical. Physically, we were a part of nature, and his work made that abundantly clear. Now, moving to the next slide, I want to draw the clear comparison here then between a mechanical universe, natural laws that make planets orbit around the sun, and the Linnaean system, which really was uncovering some sort of natural law and natural order, binding together nature and placing us firmly within the centre of it. And when you think about those two side by side, you can see that the late 1700s were ripe for somebody to talk about invisible organic laws, natural laws, that could actually produce the Linnaean system, just as there were invisible natural laws that could produce the orbit of planets around the sun. And of course that's what we're seeing when we find pre-Darwinian evolutionary thinkers of all kinds describing their evolutionary processes. The one thing is that all of them have retained this idea of an Aristotelian ladder of existence. That then is pre-Darwinian evolution. It's got a lot of the right building blocks, but it's retained an unwarranted piece of Greek philosophy that doesn't belong there. The ladder of Linnaean, the Scala Naturae of Linnaeus, is unscientific inasmuch as it is untestable. No one, to my mind, my understanding, has yet come up with a suitable definition of existence or beingness that we can test scientifically in order to ask whether whether Aristotle was onto something in talking about a progression of species from lower to higher. So on the next slide, just to examine one of the many, many pre-Darwinian evolutionary biologists, I want to revisit Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, who we normally meet in introductory textbooks on evolution as being the guy who said that giraffes grew longer necks because they stretched to reach the leaves on top of trees. He did say that, but that was almost immaterial to his theory. A lot of people believed that that was how characteristics got passed one generation to the next. Lamarck's real point was to talk about the natural law that would cause species to ascend the Scala Naturae. He viewed a purely Aristotelian process of evolution that created a ladder of increasing complexity. He didn't even believe in extinction. For him, it was simply a process of organisms striving to reach higher rungs on this ladder, and therefore leaving behind no trace of their earlier existence when they attained the next step. And so Lamarck's main point was simply to add natural process, à la Bonnet, to the Aristotelian Scala Naturae. And this was reworking, rethinking a simple Catholic natural theology that would explain creation and explain Linnaean taxonomy all at the same time. Now the key point here is that in all of these pre-Darwinian thoughts about evolution, there was no satisfactory resolution to one striking characteristic of nature, which is that of the remarkable level of design that we find when we study closely what each organism is doing. These are just some striking visual examples, but of course they abound in almost anything. Organisms are exceptionally good at doing whatever they do. And that might be a fish that looks like a piece of seaweed so as to avoid being predated. It might be an insect that looks like a flower so as to catch other insects. Or it might be a flower that looks like an insect so as to dupe bees into carrying out its pollination. The point here is simply one of exquisite design. In Aristotle's ladder of existence, there's no explicit address to why it is that organisms should be so well designed. Sure, they may be striving for a higher level of existence, but that's a rather nebulous explanation for why things should fit their environment so perfectly. And that was where we found the second layer of natural theology in or around Darwin's time. An ancient feature of natural theology that people have traced back to the Old Testament and beyond, but it's characterized most famously in William Paley's work of 1802, in which we find the watchmaker argument. Essentially, I'm sure you're familiar with it, but he just made the point that if you're walking in the park one day and your foot hits something and you look down and you see a rock, you're not terribly surprised and you don't feel the need to invoke any sort of special creation for that rock. If instead, when you look down, you find something as complex and sophisticated as a watch, your mind will start turning to causality. It's clear that watches don't spontaneously spring into being, and it would be legitimate to infer the existence of a designer who had created that watch. And so Paley's point was that in looking at natural organisms, we find such exquisite design that it's only normal, it's only natural for us to infer the existence of a watchmaker. A cosmic watchmaker in this case, and that would be the supreme creator. So finally, on that basis, we can turn now to think about Darwin's pontificating on natural selection. And Darwin's point was, of course, exceptionally simple. He strung together three simple observations into a simple logical conclusion. All natural populations contain standing bodies of variation. You can look around the room, no two of you are identical, the human population is no different from any others, and if we knew seven-spot ladybirds a little better and we studied a population of them, we would find that they were all different from one another. Organisms tend to inherit these characteristics from their parents. And the final point is that all natural populations have the capacity to increase in size indefinitely through their own reproductive efforts. And if you put those three things together, it's almost inevitable that there will be a natural selection by a struggle for survival and reproduction for lineages that best fit their environments. That then was Darwin giving rise to his own description of how we end up with not only an evolutionary process that can explain the Linnaean sort of classification hierarchy, but also a natural process that can fit organisms to their environment. And that we consider to be the birth of modern evolutionary theory. Finally, we have a testable explanation for why nature is the way that we find it. This explains the Linnaean system because as different species separate from one another at different times, the time since they're separated will determine their overall level of similarity. Ladybugs are different from one another in a single population, but they're more similar to each other than they are to other species of beetle. And beetles are more similar to each other than they are to dragonflies or to arachnids for the same principle. We just need to travel back in time, and here we have our explanation. A clockwork universe now being applied to nature, and so a clockwork process that could give rise to all of the pattern and order that has been described in nature thus far. Now, the real point for the next 10 minutes is to show you what that process does not say about where evolution is headed. Natural selection has immediate goals only. And I've never seen this point illustrated more carefully or more clearly than one of Dawkins' examples in the Blind Watchmaker book, where he makes the point that adaptations build step at a time, often leaving a footprint of their own evolutionary history. There are two types of different flatfish that exist. There are the skates and the rays that look rather as if somebody dropped a cartoon weight on a cartoon fish and squished it out sideways. And then there's the much more fudged design of things such as plaice or halibut that look like a fish that's lying on its side, and through rather strange developmental pathways, one of the eyes migrates so that it wouldn't be staring straight down into the sand, and it creeps around to the top of the skull. On the other side, one of the fins creeps around to the bottom. And we end up with a different form of flatfish, which is a rather rough and crude approximation of the elegance that we would see in skates and rays. When we come to ask about designing processes responsible for these two types of flatfish, we have a very elegant explanation when we look to evolutionary history. From some sort of primordial fish, there was an early divergence into two major groups. The cartilaginous fish, such as the sharks, which if you look at them head-on, have a rather triangular or flattened appearance. And from there, it's a relatively simple evolutionary transition to simply get flatter over time until you end up with a ray. In contrast, the bony fish spend most of their time darting around in shallower water, and a good shape for being very maneuverable is to be very tall and thin. And the problem comes that if there's now some sort of selection pressure to lie flat on the seabed or the water bottom, the easiest thing to do is to lie on your side, with the rather unfortunate consequence that one of your eyes is now staring straight downwards into the mud or the sand, and one of your fins is on the wrong side of your body. So, under that sort of system, we can understand that natural selection would favour fudges that would lead us to a second flatfish design. Why? Because it has no sense of a further goal, a deeper teleology. Natural selection doesn't know that it's trying to create a flatfish. It's simply selecting for whatever works here and now. And in one case that leads to an elegant solution, in another case it doesn't. That creates something of a problem for the William Paley watchmaker argument. It's not clear why a divine creator would arise at once with an elegant solution and on another occasion with a rather inelegant solution. We can speculate all we want about why it might be, and in fact the safest argument might be that the creator has his or her own reasons, and it's not for us to question why. But that is exactly what places intelligent design arguments really beyond the remit of science. If we can't think of a testable explanation based on design, then we have a very testable explanation based on natural selection that satisfies our yearning for some sort of insight. And this, of course, is why Richard Dawkins, when he wrote an excellent popularization of a contemporary 20th century view of evolution, named his book The Blind Watchmaker. Evolution is a designer, but it's not a designer with deep teleology. It's not a designer with foresight, and it has no interest in elegant solutions. It is a designer that works through the simple expedient of whatever survives and reproduces gives rise to what we find today. So, revisiting some of our Aristotelian ideas, when we visit a pre-Darwinian concept of evolution, we would have some sort of idea of progress. we would have an idea that a fish evolved into a reptile by crawling up onto land, and that developed further sophistication by becoming a mammal. The problem is that under natural selection, we know that any of those lineages at any given moment could undergo selection for an aquatic lifestyle once again. And if it did so, it would end up with a superficially similar morphology that had confused the Greeks and the Romans. Whether we look at a dolphin, or its dinosaur counterpart, the ichthyosaur, or whether we look at a true fish, on the surface these things look the same because they've been designed for the same criteria of swimming efficiently and fast through medium to deep water. And there's no necessary way in which natural selection needs to climb any ladder of progress that we can detect. And so when I'm teaching evolution, and when all of us teach evolution, we always slip into a shorthand that uses teleological terms, purpose-driven terms. We might look at our friend, the leafy sea dragon, a seahorse, a fish that's grown exquisitely to resemble seaweed so as to avoid predation. And typically we would say the leafy sea dragon is a fish that has evolved to look like seaweed in order to avoid being eaten by predators. But of course what we really mean by that does not involve any purpose or any teleology. What we mean, according to Darwin, is simply that the ancestors of these fish, which look more like seaweed, survived and reproduced better than their relatives who look less like seaweed. That's the sum total of teleology and natural selection. And really a point here that I want to return to at the end, and one that I think I have not seen addressed carefully enough by those who are looking for a natural theology of evolution, is to really take on board what a cruel and devastating process this is. We may choose to see progress in evolution, we may choose to see an anthropic principle, but the process of natural selection is one that is inevitably tied to an enormous amount of death and suffering. And once again, I would turn to Dawkins on this point, and from an essay he wrote called God's Utility Function, which you can find published and online in Scientific American, he wrote the following: "The total amount of suffering per year in the natural world is beyond all decent contemplation. During the minute that it takes me to compose this sentence, thousands of animals are being eaten alive. Many others are running for their lives, whimpering with fear. Others are slowly being devoured from within by rasping parasites. Thousands of all kinds are dying from starvation, thirst, and disease. It must be so, for if there is ever a time of plenty, this very fact will automatically lead to an increase in the population until the natural state of starvation and misery is restored. The universe that we observe, according to Dawkins, has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pitiless indifference." Now, I have my own views on natural theology, I'm sure you do, but I think we need to really take on board what Dawkins says there. He might be the best when it comes to recognizing basic theology as it has been expounded by others. But when he's talking about evolution, he knows what he's talking about, and that is natural selection. You may be able to hear in the background now the dawn chorus starting here in Hawaii where I am. Everything is starting to sing and chirp in a frantic effort to survive and to reproduce. It may sound aesthetically pleasing to us, and some of our great composers may choose symphonies that extol the beauty of it. But really, when you understand the biology of what they're doing, those are birds and animals staking out their territories, desperately striving to make it through one more day, find enough food, fight off their competitors, attract enough mates, they can reproduce. And that is the current step in evolution. So then, the ladder of evolutionary progress is an idea that was born with Aristotle, it was developed by the Catholic Church, and theologically inspired natural historians such as Linnaeus, but is an idea that died with Darwin's theory. Human evolution, according to Darwin's true claim, does not place us in any ascendant position over any kind of ape that you could find in the zoo today. There is no lineage that leads from chimpanzees to us. Rather, of course, we share a common ancestor with chimpanzees, great apes, and all other animals. The question is how far back in time you have to go to find that common ancestor. And yet, the idea of progressive evolution has persisted because it is one that is extremely comfortable to us, and it is one that has been in our popular psyche for a lot longer than Darwin's theory. In fact, it persisted long after Darwin. Ernst Haeckel was a developmental biologist who was famous for drawing phylogenetic trees describing evolutionary relationships. Superficially, he embraced Darwinian evolution. But if you look at his trees, they're really just a fancy rendition of Aristotle's Scala Naturae. Look at his tree carefully there, and what do we find top and centre but man? There's a museum exhibit from roughly the same time from the Yale Museum. In fact, that would have been an exhibit that Asa Gray would have walked around, in which we see the progression of forms, including apes, that should be on an equal footing to us. And probably one of the reasons why that idea has remained so persistent within our psychology is the deep cultural comfort that it brought to us, particularly during the time at which Darwin's theory was being assimilated into popular consciousness. When we look at Victorian imperialism, we look at a system that was eager for all sorts of justifications for why it should be that white British imperial civilization should be spreading throughout the globe and should be seeking to improve the lot of native peoples wherever it found itself. And that's equally true of America, so I chose a cartoon there that represents both. Note how similar that cartoon is to the Aristotelian Scala Naturae. Once again, we see humanity in a point of ascendance towards a higher state of being. And in this racist cartoon, so indicative of those imperialistic thoughts, we find the white man carrying the rather inferior races that he was encountering up towards that higher goal. The white man's burden, that famous Kipling poem. So that, then, is what is wrong with this picture. I found that online 2 years ago as an adequate representation of evolution. And of course it contains a lot of accurate contemporary information. But let's pause to consider the iconography of that picture. Pause in particular to look at the end product of evolution, once again, front and centre. And in fact, Zoe, I can ask you, I know it's highly pixelated, but if you had to take a wild guess at the gender and ethnicity of the final product of evolution, what would you say?
White man.
There you go. And if you had to take a wild stab in the dark at what sort of a person might have drawn that picture, what would you guess?
White man.
There we go. Thank you. And if I get one thing through to you today, it's to get rid of that iconography in terms of evolution, and to be very careful about that iconography when we're thinking about an anthropic principle. So, I'll skip along 2 slides just to illustrate how widespread this is. Those are just 4 cartoons. There are thousands on the internet. If you type in evolution into Google, and you type in an image search, just about every image of evolution that you will find is one that either represents or lampoons that pre-Darwinian ideology of progress towards white male humanity, right? Yeah, okay, that's it. And even in the more scientific illustrations, we would find it is there, subtly, but it is there. There are 2 illustrations I found. The one on the left, it just happens to be one that doesn't go further than primates, but guess who's top and centre, and would look to be in some sort of ascendant position. And when we look at the rather more technical one to the right, we actually see humanity labelled. And once again, the whole nature of that diagram gives the impression that evolution was somehow leading towards us. So it's everywhere. It's stayed with us. Let's be very careful here and just say, what did Darwin and what has contemporary evolution had to say about our place, for instance, relative to some of our closest cousins? One of the clearest things we can say about the biology that distinguishes us, the morphology that distinguishes us from chimpanzees and other great apes, is that we seem to be a story of evolutionary simplification, not of increased complexity. A baby chimp's skull is actually very similar to the skull of a baby human being. But as chimps and other great apes mature developmentally, their skull morphology changes, and you follow the vertical line on the left there, and you end up with an adult chimp skull that is very unlike ours. The human skull retains juvenile characteristics on intersexual maturity. And by far the most parsimonious explanation is that the particular lineage that gave rise to us is one that has actually switched off, turned off, and gotten rid of evolutionary complexity that was present in some of our ancestral conditions. The most comforting way that we can explain that particular fact would be to say that over time there has been selection for our intelligence. And you'll notice that by retaining that skull morphology, and our skull of course is much larger in the adult, although the rough proportions are much more similar to the baby, we end up with a much larger brain case than that of the chimpanzee. It's a very comforting thought, and it's one that we like, but I'll just put it to you to be contrary, that we have about as much evidence for a rather different explanation, which is that throughout different cultures and different times, one of the most common and standard marks of beauty is the retention of childlike or youthful characteristics in the female. And just to be perverse, there is about as much evidence that could tell us that the reason we have such a large brain case and such large intelligence has been prolonged sexual selection in our lineage for youthful characteristics in females. We just don't know at this stage. What we can say is that we are simpler than our cousins, and that we ourselves seem to represent, if anything, a step downwards in terms of biological complexity from our ancestors. In fact, if we look at the geological record, you would find that people would typically refer to the era in which we live as the Cenozoic, the age of mammals. There's a beautiful artist depiction of how we think about this Cenozoic era, the last 65 million years. But it really is not a very objective description. For example, in this Cenozoic period, there are about twice as many species of bird now in existence as there are species of mammals. And in fact, if we're more objective still, we would note on a pie chart of life diversity as we encounter it today, that the entire branch of evolution that includes fish, amphibians, birds, reptiles, and mammals is completely dwarfed by the slice of the pie chart that represents insects. And in fact, even within insects, there are way more species of beetle than there are just about everything else put together. So that caused the atheistic evolutionary thinker Haldane, when he was prompted by an interviewer to ask what he had learned about the Creator from his studies of evolution, his comment was the Creator, if he exists, has an inordinate fondness for beetles. This is not really the age of mammals, and it certainly doesn't show many signs of being the age of humanity from an evolutionary perspective. In fact, a modern tree of life's genetic diversity has a very different picture of where we belong than where we might think that we belong. Forget 5 kingdoms, animals, plants, fungi, protists, and bacteria. The modern way of thinking about life's diversity suggests that there are 3 fundamental domains of life, including 2 branches of bacteria, which we didn't even distinguish from one another until we developed the molecular techniques of the last generation. Those are the green branches and the orange branches, and those types of bacteria are as different from one another as either of them is from us. And when we seek to find all the stuff that Linnaeus was describing, we would find that fungus, plants, and animals occupy a tiny twig on the 3rd branch, right there. So that would be our position genetically, and on the pie chart we see our position in terms of species abundance, and that would be the role in which an objective scientific description of humanity would find us today. Now, there is a ton more that I could say, and in fact, in preparing this lecture, most of what I originally intended to talk to you about is what happens next, the contemporary stuff in evolution. I'm actually going to do no more than 3 minutes on that now, but I would welcome questions on that if everything that I've said to you so far is already deeply familiar. Suffice it for me simply to finish by saying, and I'll ask Zoe if you can go through until we've got all 3 of these red markers on there, that the 20th century has had a series of major impacts on, or re-evaluations of Darwin's theory. One of the first was Darwin's fusion with Mendelian genetics and its growth into the neo-Darwinian synthesis. And for our purposes, one of the most significant byproducts of that growth point in evolution was the realization that nothing an organism can do within its own lifetime can affect its evolution, other than to survive and reproduce. That whole Lamarckian concept of striving, or of seeking to achieve a higher state of being, is completely divorced from the evolutionary process that we can look at. And I can go into that in greater detail in questions if you'd like. The second major insight from the middle of the 20th century was a realization that evolution does not work for the good of the species or the good of the group, typically. Typically, evolution gets undermined by lower and lower levels. And this was the essence of Dawkins' book, The Selfish Gene. And although I have serious reservations about a lot of Dawkins' more recent publications, particularly where he starts pontificating on theology, I would recommend The Blind Watchmaker and The Selfish Gene as excellent primates in the way that 20th century biology has come to think about evolution. The final insight, and one that you won't find in Dawkins, and really one that transitions us into the 21st century, is the molecular revolution, which has given us the realization that when we truly study evolution as it is, change in genetic composition over time, we actually find out that even that change is not dominated by Darwin's process of selection. The majority of change that gives rise to organic diversity is not about adapting organisms to their environment, but rather it is about meaningless random changes in a very junky and very ill-designed genetic code, our genome. Okay, and I think, let me just cycle through this. Yep. Okay, I'm actually going to ask Zoe if we can just move forwards to the one that says the Age of Reason, slide 53. And before I open up for questions, I want to put this to you, that typically the Age of Reason in America is confused with the Age of Enlightenment. It seems to be a synonym over here for the Age of Enlightenment. So if you look up the Age of Reason in Wikipedia, you would find out that the Age of Reason is the early 17th century philosophy that is associated with rationalism, the earliest part of the Enlightenment. And under that view, the Age of Reason is really the era in which this quest for objective testability and scientific reevaluation of the cosmos opened up this new view of who we are and what our position is within nature. A point of interest for me when I was first preparing a lecture along these lines a couple of years ago was to notice in the Catholic theology, the Age of Reason has a second meaning, which is the name given to that period of human life at which persons are deemed to begin to be morally responsible. And I would like to finish today by drawing a comparison between those two. Really, if, in my view, my humble view, if we want to talk about a natural theology about evolution, we need to take on board what it is that has been uncovered since the Enlightenment. We need to be very careful about slipping into comfortable Aristotelian views about evolution as being God's straightforward mechanism of creating us as sentient beings capable of perceiving the universe and worshipping God. And we need to be morally responsible for all of those findings that we've uncovered about the flaws in that process. I don't think it's for any second impossible to reconcile natural theology with everything that I've just said to you, but I would like to see the natural theology debate take a whole step forwards to thinking about the suffering, the disease, to thinking about this whole question about whether we are in any meaningful sense higher than other elements of nature we find around us. And so, I think that I would just finish by leaving that slide up there that you can read during questions, but it was a curious similarity that I found between Dawkins in one of his more philosophical modes and a much earlier statement by Thomas Aquinas. And the point for me of those two quotes that I leave up there now is to say that if there's one thing that I think we can all agree on as we study nature, it's that it is a legitimate and noble use of our powers of reason and our powers of objective inquiry to try and further our understanding of our place in nature. And with that, I'll finish. Thank you very much.
Right, thank you very much indeed, Stephen, for that. That was brilliant. We heard it all very clearly over here, and the slides were extremely clear. So we'll have a time with questions now, and I'll just walk to the person who's going to ask a question. You have to speak right into the microphone clearly. And let's start with Erna, right on the front row here. Erna McMullen. Yep.
This has been a very interesting contrast with what we've been hearing earlier in the meeting. We heard quite a bit about the history of science from the point of view of the growth of science in the Middle Ages and so on. But what struck me very much about your presentation is that it focused on all the ways that in the past they were wrong, whereas most of what we heard here was a focus on the ways in which they were right. It was an extraordinarily interesting contrast. And let me take one example, one very important example. Aristotle, that phrase that you quote from Bertrand Russell has been overquoted. Aristotle classified more than 500 species. He classified more species than any modern biologist. His two great works on biology are entirely observational. They make mistakes, as that particular one, but he was first and foremost a biologist. You characterized him as a philosopher, and you contrasted that, so to speak, with science. But I mean, that's not really quite fair to Aristotle, I think. Aristotle was not a scientist in the modern fashion, but I mean, he was most extraordinarily committed to the detail of the living world of his day, to a quite extraordinary extent, it would seem today. He had specimens sent back from the Far East, for example, not the Far East, from the Middle East. And so I kind of wonder at the general slant of what we've been hearing.
So, did you hear all that, Steve?
I did.
Yes.
I did. And I think the very first thing I want to say is that's why it's such a pleasure to be able to speak to you all, because normally I would give a talk with elements of this in to assemble groups of biologists or physicists. Very rarely do I have an audience who can help me deepen my appreciation of some of the non-scientific characters in what I'm talking about. I am aware and humbled to realise that I was aware that the big difference, one of the big differences between Aristotle and Plato was Aristotle's faith in the senses, and as opposed to Plato's absolute disregard for sensory information. And I thank you for that comment. I think that perhaps, and I want to assure you that I will change this lecture in light of what you said, because that's really gone to heart. What perhaps I should say is that with more delicacy in the future, I want to draw attention to the persistent danger of assumptions within science. Aristotle's genius of thought was only compromised from a modern scientific standpoint by those areas in which he took reason to be superior to observation. And clearly, he had enormous respect for sensory input and for observation, and you're right, in many senses, he was the proto-scientist from everything that we've inherited from the Greeks. But I think, from what I've read, which isn't much, his thinking was in places compromised by that natural human tendency for us to overlook that which is so obvious to us that we cease to critically examine it. And that really isn't a criticism of philosophers, it's a criticism of humanity. It's a criticism of Haeckel, placing white man at the top of his phylogenetic trees. It's a criticism of me as a 21st century biologist, making all sorts of assumptions, which if I'm really lucky during my lifetime, I will occasionally stumble across and will start to become some of the more interesting questions I can think about. That would be my response in a nutshell. Does that help in any way?
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, we have another question over here.
Thank you very much, Stephen. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Just one. I'm a physicist, so this, I may get this completely wrong, so don't mind me if I don't. But one big shock for me in your talk, which I don't doubt, but just one big surprise was, I was well aware of natural selection as opposed to evolution. That Darwin's big discovery was the mechanism. And the mechanism was natural selection, and of course that made a prediction, for example, about the age of the Earth, and that's why it had such impact on society, etc., among other things. But the big shock for me was in the last 3 points you made. As is stated in the Blind Watchmaker and many other places, I thought the whole point is that it's not a random process. That this thing is driven by natural selection. It's not random, etc., etc. Where a couple of times I've been giving a talk to the public on cosmology and making comparisons with evolution, and exactly that people have contradicted me and said that Darwinism has been revised and there is a random selection. So could you explain a little bit about that?
Yeah, please do let me do that. Now, the first thing is, I think that what you've just described in the way of people contradicting you, they may be talking cross purposes because they're probably talking about neutral evolution, which is the finding that although the Darwinian process of non-random selection, you're absolutely right, although that is absolutely real, and although that does account for all of the exquisite design that we see in nature, that design is itself a tiny percentage of the genetic material that we're all carrying. And so for every atom of design, we contain a block of junk that is evolving. Now, perhaps the easiest sort of factoid to sort of latch onto there is that the most rapidly evolving genetic material is the junkiest. And so when you look at forensic testing, genetic fingerprinting very explicitly chooses parts of the genetic material that serve no function whatsoever, and in fact are so broken and so garbagey that almost every time they're copied, they go wrong, meaning that they're almost always different. And that's what makes them useful as genetic fingerprints. Now, all of that is true, but none of that gets to your central point about the non-randomness within cosmology. And I want to talk about that a lot more tomorrow. I know that Professor Conway Morris is going to talk about that a lot more tomorrow. So, if I may, I will say for now that really the interesting, or the fascinating point of scientific inquiry for me in the 21st century is to look at the yin and the yang of those two sides of evolution. Mutations are random, and when we started to understand the Mendelian basis for genetics, that point that it prevented any mechanism that we've yet to find by which organisms can influence their own evolution by their own aspirations. Mutations have to be random. They only occur in DNA, and the DNA in which they occur cannot be sort of retro-acted upon by the bodies in which that DNA occurs. So the raw stuff with which natural selection works is random. But you're absolutely right that natural selection itself then sifts through those random mutations in order to produce non-randomness of the most incredible kind. Now, I feel like I'm adding layers of complexity to what you're trying to ask, but really the point of inquiry for biological cosmologists is to say that although every organism is being perpetually fitted to its environment, we have yet to ascertain whether there are any grand patterns in the long-term process of evolution. It's not a weak analogy, but the one that just springs to mind as I'm talking to you is to say in a game of chess, every rule is very well prescribed and is non-random, but there are as good as infinite numbers of games of chess that can be played. And something very similar to that is what's happening biologically. At any given step, natural selection is fitting an organism to its environment. Whether that process of fitting spirals upwards and upwards into the much longer time spans that describe how an amoeba or a single-celled creature in one lineage could give rise to us, that's the one that's open to question, and that's really the focal point of tomorrow's lecture. Does that help? I feel like I've answered three different ways.
That's fine, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you. Another question. Another question over here.
The assumption is that we are not experiencing increasing complexity as you look at evolution. I've always thought that the human mind is supposed to be much more complex than anything else, and when you consider the way in which all the human minds in the world are interacting today socially, you've got a complexity phenomenon going on there which would seem to me to be more complex than anything else that's ever evolved. It does seem at first sight that there is, if you like, a ladder of complexity going on here.
Thank you. Okay, so I think that really gets us to that nexus that how can I, sorry, I'm collecting my thoughts as I speak. 6 o'clock in the morning, right? Yes, I think if we chose human brain complexity as a measure of complexity, we would come out on top. It's unambiguous. I have yet to be aware of any other organisms that have literature, poetry, art, science, whatever. I think the point from a biological point of view or from an orthodox evolutionary point of view is it's not at all clear as to why we should choose brain complexity as our measure of how things progress over time. If other organisms were to draw their own scala naturae, they would probably pick the features which they represent best. Now that could be fecundity, or it could be looking like a piece of seaweed, or it could be number of cells in the body, or size of genome. If we chose size of genome, amount of genetic material as our measure of complexity, then things like carrots would come out so far ahead of us that we would be rather embarrassed by it. So I think that this really gets back to what we were saying with the commentary on the metaphysics of apes, is that if we were seeking to understand what makes us different or special within nature, the obvious point is our powers of reasoning, our consciousness, and our complexity of social interactions. If we're seeking to measure the natural process of genetic change over time, then it is entirely unclear as to how and why that should connect to brain complexity in any sort of inescapable fashion. Does that work? I mean, please feel free to comment back on that and tell me I've missed your point.
I'll think on that one.
Think of that.
Okay.
Right. I'll comment on that. Okay, we have a comment here from Professor Gisum.
I actually have maybe more than one comment, if I can be allowed. On that specific point, what I tell my children when we look at things that are sophisticated, beautiful, artsy, etc., I tell them, think of how much work or how much time it would take you to describe the thing or to put it together, or how much knowledge and skill it would take to do this. The analogy that I'm trying to draw here is we don't have to pick brain complexity. We don't have to try to be biased or anything, and the carrots will not choose their own, orange color as the best feature, etc. It is complexity nowadays can be measured. It's the amount of information that you need in order to describe something, describe a system or an organism, and something like that. So it is completely objective, it is completely unbiased. Just take any piece, alien or human or natural, and just measure its complexity in terms of information. And by that measure, I don't think that we would come out anything but at the top. This is one. Two, I would like to ask you just maybe bluntly, do you think that humans are a fluke of the evolutionary development? In other words, this is, Simon Conway Morris will be here tomorrow, so he will speak for himself, but the famous question is, Simon would say, in comparison to what Stephen Jay Gould used to say, if you rerun the tape, Stephen Jay Gould would say, you would not end up with anything like what we see today.
Right.
And Simon would say, if we rerun the tape, according to his convergent evolution, we would not appear as we are today, but there would be species that are of high complexity, something similar, maybe very different looking, but something complex enough, like we are, or like apes or something, that would qualify as whatever we call complex or complicated or sophisticated. So do you think that that is completely wrong, that we are just here by a total accident, that if we rerun the tape according to this randomness, we would end up with just basically a bunch of bacteria and algae and things like this, or there would be complexity, in which case, who cares how many billions of species there are out there and how complex the tree looks, if at the end you end up with something that is very complex and sophisticated?
Sure. Thank you for both comments and questions. And if I may, I'm just going to deal with them chronologically the way you presented them. I think the first comment that you make about the measures of complexity is one where I see it differently. If we literally ask the amount of coding DNA, and our measure of information is the number of relevant nucleotide monomers, sorry, this is stuff we'll get into tomorrow, encoding that organism, there are so many organisms on Earth that would come out way ahead of us because they simply have more genes, more genetic information, more relevant genetic information. So I think this is my point, is that I have nothing against choosing brain complexity as our measure, but that places us, in my mind, beyond current evolutionary understanding as to why that one measure should be a more objective measure of complexity than, say, total amount of coding DNA or number of interacting molecules in metabolism. Now, that isn't to say it's incorrect at all, but my point here would be that it is more one of philosophy and spirituality as to how we ascend above nature than it is one of evolutionary biology. Evolutionary biology measures changes in DNA, and those changes do not correlate clearly with brain complexity, and it's not clear that brain complexity would be the one measure that we could go for. Now, I must admit you're probably more of an expert in the application of information theory to nature than I am, from what you've just said. I'm aware of it a little bit from some of the intelligent design theorists who have sought to apply it in order to make the case that some things are so complex they couldn't have arisen through natural selection. I understand that isn't your point, but I would argue that their application of information theory to quantify how complex something is shows us how fraught with problems that is for a scientific debate. Are we more complex, more sophisticated, intellectually, culturally? Definitely. Do I think that that gives us a form of ascendance above nature? Definitely. Can I place that ascendance within an evolutionary framework? No. That would just be an evolutionary biologist's sort of commentary, a counterpoint to what you've said, but I mean, this is a debate that could continue. I think to answer your question, let me answer it as a scientist and as an individual who's a religious Orthodox Christian. As a scientist, the whole interesting point to me, and the one that I want to talk about tomorrow, is that I don't think we know. I don't think the evidence is in. I think that the counterpoint of Gould's cosmos versus Conway-Morris cosmos, biologically, is a very interesting debate for the 21st century. And I feel that what Conway Morris did that was so important was to open up that debate and to show that Gould had made the same mistake as I ascribed perhaps wrongly to Aristotle. Gould slipped into thinking that things were so obvious that they didn't really need testing. And I think that what Conway Morris has done is to show us that there's at least as much evidence for a converse point of view, that maybe evolution was leading, in some sense, towards something sentient such as ourselves. And bringing that debate within the boundaries of legitimate science is something that I'm really excited to see happen in the 21st century. Now, if I may, let me just ask, for a quick show of hands, really the whole point of the lecture that I've been preparing for tomorrow was to compare and contrast Gould's universe with Conway Morris, and then just to talk briefly about how my work fits into that. If all of you are familiar with the Gould-Conway Morris debate, then I'm going to skip over 9/10 of what I was going to say and get to the meaty stuff. Could I just ask by show of hands, how many of you are familiar with the concept of the Gould, don't rewind, if you rewind the tape of life, it's unfamiliar, versus Conway Morris, you would get something out that you knew?
Show of hands, right. 1,
Okay.
2, 3, 4. Can you see?
So if it's okay,
6, 7, 8. There's only 9.
I apologise that to 5 of you, we're really going to tread those boards tomorrow, but it looks as if that debate is worth having for a lot of other people,
Yes.
and you may be very familiar with it, and I would just ask you to do me the same favour as you're doing right now, which is to correct my oversimplification or my misrepresentation of either side of that debate. But sorry, that was a bit of a digression. Okay, let me return to you and ask whether my comment and or answer, does that address what you asked?
On the comment, of course, I was not talking about the intelligent design. Let's look at
Sure.
the flagellum and try to do what Dembski has been doing or trying to do. I am not an expert on information theory, but I think there is room for discussion there. I think it's
And that I can agree with you on.
Yeah. On the discussion on the Gould versus Conway Morris discussion, I still would like to know what you think or what.
Oh yeah, sorry. Yeah.
But again, as you say, tomorrow you will be explaining all of that, and Simon will be here, and I suppose this is maybe the new great debate.
I think I would be very pleased if orthodox evolutionary biology were able to get past its own prejudice about the spiritual connotations of that debate in order to welcome it as an important new scientific debate. If that were to happen over the next decade, I would be very excited as an evolutionary biologist. And I think that is something worth fighting for in a community such as the one in front of me here. To say that this is an interesting debate. And I guess to some of you it's going to make a lot more sense tomorrow. Let me just say, sorry, one sentence because I was rude not to answer you personally. Personally, do I think we were inevitable? I guess that again, my answer is I don't know. In my personal life, my spiritual journey has led me to believe that God is not likely to convince me of my spirituality through observations of the living world. Or, no, that's wrong. Let me say this. I have not in my life encountered the sort of observation of the living world which acts as a smoking gun pointer towards the existence of God. That is a purely personal reflection on what I have and have not experienced. So that leaves me unconvinced that I'm likely, through my own evolutionary work, to end up with such a sense of inevitable humanity that my religious convictions become almost mandatory. I hope that I remain open enough to see whether that changes over the next few decades.
Stephen, I just want to tell you the results from your show of hands was about 25% said they were familiar with the Gould, Simon Conway Morris sort of discussion, which I guess left around 75% who would like to have it addressed in your talk tomorrow.
Thank you.
Yeah, just to give you a flavour. Just in case, I didn't know if you could see the whole room, so I did do a quick count of hands. We're going to take maybe one or two more questions, and then we should stop. Yes.
Thank you. I'm Steve, another Stephen. A lot of this is new territory for me, so there's something I'm not understanding, and I'm not able to reconcile a couple of things you've said due to my understanding, no doubt, or lack thereof. You acknowledge that we are ascended in the various ways that you've said, we as humans, and yet there seems to be a reluctance to attribute that to evolution, or a reluctance to really make a direct correlation between where we are in our evolution and those qualities which you would acknowledge as that would make us recognizable as ascendant. Is that right so far?
Yeah.
Or maybe correct me.
I would say that those things that would be easiest to point at as ascendant qualities of our species are not ones that I feel fall clearly within the evolutionary boundaries that we can study.
Okay. But mustn't you connect those qualities, and mustn't you connect all of our qualities with our evolution? And if you don't necessarily connect them, I don't understand how to what you might attribute those qualities.
Great question, and that shows me that I'm just being too whiffly in what I'm trying to state of my own spirituality in this. Of course, I believe that our brains, our culture, our everything that makes us us is a product of evolution. Or I guess there is no of course about that. I believe that as an evolutionary biologist. The break that I make between evolution and our ascendant qualities, for want of a better term, is purely to say that they are somehow evolutionarily meaningful. Perhaps the easiest way, or that they are meaningful above other evolutionary ascendances. Perhaps the easiest way that I can contrast this is to go a little bit further than I would naturally go, but to talk about pantheism, and to talk about a natural theology that sees God throughout nature. If we contemplate the beauty of a rainforest or a coral reef, or the beauty of an earthworm, the sophistication, the sense of awe and wonder of looking into the night sky, these are all points of ascendancy within creation. But I think that the perception of ascendancy is one that is a byproduct of our ability to think and to be conscious. And that, whilst a product of evolution, I'm not at all sure is an inevitable product of evolution or a purpose of evolution. There you go. I'm sorry, I've just realised that's the word that I should be using to try and clarify all of this. It's the teleology, it's the purpose that Aristotle saw. Do I think that the purpose of evolution was to produce sentience, consciousness, spirituality? I don't see how we can measure that with our science. Do I believe that sentience, that consciousness exists and allows us to appreciate the whole of nature? Yes. And for me, part of that appreciation is to see as much beauty and sophistication in a dolphin or a bacterium or a flagellum as in our own ability to write Jane Austen novels.
Tomorrow, I'd like to ask a follow-up tomorrow. If I may.
Okay, we're going to have a follow-up. We're going to have fun. Stephen, we're going to have to finish there. And we greatly look forward to your next talk, which for you is going to be on the same day, isn't it?
I'm going to sleep for a few hours.
Oh, you are going to sleep? Because we're going to go to bed and have a whole night's sleep and get up in the morning and then listen to you. You're going to be speaking to us again on the same day. Yeah, okay. But
thank you ever so much. I really appreciate the commentary, and please, especially for those of you who are familiar with the debate tomorrow, please don't be abashed to tell me where I'm oversimplifying, misrepresenting. That's the key to this exchange to me. So thank you very much for what you've done already today. I appreciate it.
Well, we want to thank you again very much indeed for a fascinating talk. So.